What if I told you that the most significant turning point of the Vietnam War wasn't a military defeat, but rather a victory that appeared to be just that? Imagine U.S. generals so fixated on a distant base that they overlooked the largest surprise attack of the entire war, despite warnings that had been coming in for months. The Tet Offensive shattered America's confidence overnight. But there's much more to the story, a tale of ignored intelligence, ideological blindness, and political consequences so severe that they ultimately contributed to the downfall of a presidency. In 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops launched attacks on 39 out of 44 provincial capitals in South Vietnam, 5 of the 6 largest cities, including Saigon, 71 district capitals, around 50 hamlets, nearly every Allied airfield, and many critical military installations. This offensive took the White House, Mamie CV, and the American public completely by surprise. The shock was magnified by prior assurances from both the military and the Johnson administration that progress was being made in the war, with the end in sight. Even though the Communists faced significant tactical defeats in the intense fighting of 1968, the Tet Offensive delivered a profound psychological blow that marked the turning point of the war, triggering events that would lead to Richard Nixon's election, a long and bloody U.S. withdrawal from Southeast Asia, and ultimately the fall of South Vietnam. When considering Tet and its aftermath, it's essential to first ask how the Communist offensive managed to catch everyone off guard. U.S. military intelligence had indications that the Communists were planning something significant. The first sign of a change in their strategy emerged in March 1967, when South Vietnamese troops captured a document that hinted at a major direct assault on Saigon. Over the following months, numerous indicators would continue to surface. The suggestion that something was brewing became increasingly evident in April and May, when U.S. Marines engaged in fierce skirmishes with North Vietnamese troops in the hills around the remote base at Khe San, near the Laotian border in I Corps, and translating Vietnamese documents, reports, and other resources. At the same time, more North Vietnamese forces initiated the first of many attempts to seize or destroy the Marine base at Con Thien, situated just south of the DMZ. These clashes differed from the usual enemy attacks. They were more intense and lasted longer. The reasons behind the enemy's escalation in those specific areas wouldn't become clear until much later. On October 16, 1967, ARVN units in the Mekong Delta discovered a 3-page memo from the Regional Party Committee dated September 2nd, mentioning the Winter-Spring campaign and outlining plans for a new offensive. Then on October 25th, ARVN troops in the Tay Ninh region recovered another document detailing a 3-pronged offensive aimed at overcoming South Vietnamese forces, dismantling U.S. political and military structures, and sparking a nationwide uprising among the masses. This forthcoming offensive was labeled TCK-TKN, short for Tong Kong Kich Tong Coi Nha, General Offensive General Uprising. Around the same time, ARVN troops found yet another document regarding sapper training and tactics for VC and PAN personnel against South Vietnamese mechanized units. On October 27th, the Communists launched an attack on Lac Ninh, a district capital in Bin Long Province, 3 Corps. In an unusual move, they attempted to hold the town, suffering heavy losses when U.S. forces, aided by artillery and air support, expelled them. Intelligence officials were baffled by the enemy's decision to fight, incurring substantial losses for what seemed like a futile objective. This battle represented the first instance of coordinated attacks by large units from various divisions by the Communists. It would later be revealed that the VC had been honing their urban assault strategies and large-scale coordinated maneuvers in preparation for the upcoming offensive. On November 4th, a U.S. patrol in the Central Highlands, southwest of Dak To, encountered a North Vietnamese main force unit entrenched in a hillside. Mirroring the situation at Lac Ninh, the Communists engaged in battle, deploying elements of the NVA 1st Division along with 2 additional regiments, leading to a fierce 2-week conflict. The intensity and length of the fighting at Dak To diverged from the usual patterns seen in the region's Communist forces. Along with the assault at Lac Ninh and the fierce clashes at Dak To, there were additional indicators that something significant was occurring. A surge of attacks took place in Din Tuong Province, a traditional ground for the VC to test new tactics. Furthermore, intelligence reports suggested that desertion rates among communist troops were on the decline, as many soldiers had apparently been told that victory was imminent and the nation would soon be liberated. In the following 2 months, more captured documents hinted at an impending offensive. One of the most notable was a military directive from the COSVN B3 Front Command, which oversaw communist operations in central South Vietnam. This document came into the hands of Allied forces in mid-November 1967, calling for large-scale, well-coordinated combat operations designed to destroy or disintegrate a significant portion of the puppet army. It particularly emphasized instructions to annihilate a major U.S. unit to compel the enemy to commit more troops to the Western Highlands. On November 19th, the situation became clearer. U.S. troops from the 2nd Battalion, 327th Airborne, operating in Quang Tinh Province in I Corps, seized a 13-page notebook containing an order titled Ho Chi Minh's Order for Implementation of General Counteroffensive and General Uprising during 1967 winter and 1968 spring and summer. This document was translated and shared with U.S. and South Vietnamese intelligence agencies, packaged as a detailed memorandum from the Defense Intelligence Agency. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon even released a press statement highlighting several details from the notebook. Despite this, the spread of this intelligence does not seem to have substantially influenced Allied strategies or preparations. On November 25, 1967, Allied forces in Tay Ninh Province captured a 10-page document dated September 1, 1967. This document, essentially a training manual titled Clearly Understand the New Situation and Mission, Take Advantage of Victories to Surge Forward and Complete Defeat the U.S. and Puppet Enemy, outlined the strategy and objectives for a new offensive. In the months leading up to the offensive, the U.S. and South Vietnamese had access to a wealth of clear intelligence that suggested the Communists were preparing for significant action. In late November, the CIA station in Saigon gathered various intelligence indicators and released a report titled The Big Gamble. This wasn't a formal intelligence assessment or a prediction, but rather a compilation of observations that indicated a shift in the Communist strategy. The report also adjusted enemy strength estimates to much higher levels than previously thought. Military intelligence analysts at MASSIV disagreed with the CIA's findings, as they were revising their own methods for assessing the enemy and were lowering their estimates of enemy capabilities. However, as more intelligence emerged, Westmoreland and his team concluded that a large countrywide effort was likely. All the signs pointed to an impending major offensive. Most of the increased enemy activity was observed along the DMZ and near the Cambodian and Laotian borders. Further intelligence, particularly from signals analysis, indicated a substantial buildup in the Khe Sanh area, close to the Laotian border in I Corps tactical zone. Convinced this was the primary threat, General Westmoreland directed much of his focus on the northern provinces. At the same time, evidence continued to accumulate that the enemy was planning something significant. On December 4th, the 198th Light Infantry Brigade, operating in Quang Nam Province, found a document that appeared to outline objectives for an upcoming all-out offensive, indicating that VC cadres would work in populated areas to incite a popular uprising. On January 4, 1968, U.S. troops in the Central Highlands discovered a document labeled Operation Order No. 1, which specified an attack on Pleiku prior to Tet. Shortly after, ARVN soldiers seized a similar order for an assault on Ban Mathuot, although no specific date was provided. Just before Christmas 1967, intelligence reports noted a staggering 200% increase in truck traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos during October and November, confirming to Westmoreland and his team that the enemy was mobilizing. Preparing for a significant escalation, Westmoreland and his intelligence team were unaware that the Communists possessed the capacity for such a sweeping assault. His attention remained fixated on Khe Sanh, where he perceived the greatest threat. Concerned about the escalating situation and new intelligence reports, Westmoreland urged the South Vietnamese to cancel the upcoming Tet ceasefire nationwide. On January 8th, General Cao Van Vien, the head of the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, informed Westmoreland that he would attempt to limit the truce to 24 hours. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu contended that canceling the 48-hour truce would negatively impact the morale of both his troops and the populace. Nonetheless, he agreed to compress the ceasefire to 36 hours, starting the evening of January 29th. Both Westmoreland and the White House were consumed by the unfolding events at Khe Sanh. Westmoreland firmly believed that the Pa Ven buildup in the region indicated a communist effort to seize the northern provinces. In response, he dispatched the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division from the Central Highlands to Phu Bai, just south of Hue, and sent a brigade from the 101st Airborne Division to I Corps to bolster defenses in the two northernmost provinces. By the end of January, over half of all U.S. combat battalions were stationed in the I Corps area, prepared to confront any new threats. On January 21st, the North Vietnamese initiated the first large-scale shelling of the Marine base at Khe Sanh, leading to intense clashes between enemy forces and Marines in the hills surrounding the base. In a communication to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Westmoreland stated, "These attacks on January 20th and 21st were likely precursors to a full-scale assault on Khe Sanh. I believe the enemy will launch a nationwide display of strength just before Tet, with Khe Sanh as the focal point." Westmoreland was convinced that the bombardment was the commencement of the anticipated general offensive. The parallels between the situation at Khe Sanh and the French experience at Dien Bien Phu heightened the urgency surrounding the developments there. Weyand, the commander of the 2 Field Force, received Westmoreland's approval to bolster Saigon's defenses, but not much else was done to enhance security in other cities and towns. Westmoreland believed, at least from his perspective, that the primary enemy assaults would originate in the north. When the initial attacks on January 30th were followed by even broader assaults the next day and night, both Massey V and the White House were taken aback by the scope and intensity of the offensive. The Tet Offensive was viewed, as National Security Council staff member William Jordan pointed out in a February 1968 message to Presidential Advisor Walt Rostow, as the worst intelligence failure of the war. However, after the conflict, some military officers who served as commanders and intelligence analysts in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive claimed that the MACV headquarters was aware of a shift in North Vietnamese strategy, but was only caught off guard by the actual scale and coordination of the attacks. Many historians and observers dismiss these assertions and have sought to grasp how the communists managed to achieve such a breathtaking level of surprise. Several explanations have been proposed. First, the Allied assessments of enemy strength and intentions were flawed. Part of the issue was that Matt V, in an attempt to showcase progress in the war, intentionally lowered the intelligence estimates regarding VC PAVN's strength. CIA analyst Sam Adams later accused Mac V of falsifying intelligence reports to reflect progress in the war. Whether this allegation holds true remains debatable, but it is a fact that MAC-CV adjusted how they counted the enemy, reducing their strength estimate from nearly 300,000 to 235,000 in December 1967. U.S. military intelligence analysts seemingly accepted their revised estimates and largely overlooked the growing evidence that the Communists not only preserved a significant combat capability, but intended to employ it in a striking manner. Former South Vietnamese Colonel Hong Ngoc Lung, in a post-war paper written for the U.S. Army about the 1968 offensive, noted that Allied intelligence analysts dismissed many captured documents as mere wishful thinking from the Communists. The documents were seen as simply reflecting the aspirations and intentions of the Communists, rather than clear evidence of their actual capabilities, at least as understood by Allied commanders and intelligence analysts. As a result, the Allies seriously underestimated the enemy's abilities and dismissed new intelligence reports that conflicted with their established beliefs about the Communists' strength and potential. They assumed the enemy lacked the capacity to launch a nationwide campaign. These firmly held views acted as blinders, distorting how senior Allied commanders and intelligence officers interpreted information that didn't align with their preconceived ideas. Similarly, enemy documents and other evidence were brushed aside because analysts doubted the communists would risk significant losses for uncertain goals. Even if the communists managed to occupy cities, could they hold them against a strong Allied response? Consequently, the reports didn't seem logical to the Allied military intelligence analysts. This assessment, of course, hinged on who was determining what was considered logical. Some analysts even believed the enemy was retreating to a more defensive phase of their revolutionary strategy. They thought that U.S. search and destroy operations in 1967 had forced the communists into this defensive stance, and that they lacked the ability to shift from defense to a broad offensive. Even when there was consensus that an offensive was being planned, analysts assumed it was far off, citing Giap's statements about the war's protracted nature. These beliefs overshadowed signs that indicated an imminent escalation. Additionally, an issue contributing to intelligence failures during Tet is what we now call fusion. The data collected was hard to piece together into a clear, cohesive understanding of the communists' actions. Analysts often struggled to integrate all the information, even though they were responsible for creating comprehensive assessments. This should have made it easier to combine various indicators into a comprehensive analysis. A significant part of the issue stemmed from the lack of coordination among Allied intelligence agencies. Many of these groups operated on their own and seldom shared their findings. This was also true within military intelligence. The absence of coordination and information sharing hindered the integration of available intelligence and prevented the necessary combination to thwart the enemy's surprise offensive when it occurred. Even if the Allied intelligence network had been more effective at merging information, it would still have faced conflicting reports that complicated the situation. While some intelligence suggested a general offensive was imminent, other reports pointed to the enemy experiencing severe struggles in the field and a sharp decline in morale. It became challenging to decide which reports to trust. Moreover, some troubling indicators were drowned out by louder, more predictable threats from adversaries. Confronted with signs of heightened enemy activity near urban centers and along the country's borders, the Allies had to make tough choices about where, when, and how the main attack would come. They struggled to make the right call, fixating on the escalating conflict near Khe Sanh and other distant locations. Despite the growing intelligence reports, General Westmoreland and his analysts failed to foresee a nationwide offensive. They anticipated maybe a show of force, believing that the enemy's primary focus would remain on the northern provinces. When evidence confirmed that PAVN units were gathering near Khe Sanh, coinciding with ground attacks on the firebase on January 21st, it aligned perfectly with what Westmoreland and his team had already predicted. As a result, they assessed the intelligence through the lens of their existing beliefs, concentrating on Khe Sanh and dismissing most other signals that didn't align with their preconceived ideas about enemy capabilities and intentions. The surprise of the Tet offensive had an impact that cannot be overlooked. The sheer scale and intensity of the attacks took the American public by surprise. Even though the offensive led to a significant tactical defeat for the communist forces, the very fact that they executed such a surprise attack against the Allies played a crucial role in their strategic victory and marked a turning point in the war. While it's evident that there was a significant intelligence failure on the Americans' part, we should also consider the other side and examine the influence of intelligence in planning and preparing for the general offensive. The PAVN and VC endured devastating losses during the 1968 Tet offensive, raising questions about the effectiveness of communist intelligence efforts prior to these violent assaults. This inquiry should be approached from two angles. First, what did the communists aim to accomplish with the offensive? And second, what assumptions and intelligence evaluations informed their strategy? The choice to initiate the general offensive in 1968 stemmed from years of intense internal conflict and vigorous discussions regarding both policy and military strategy within the communist ranks. Although we can't delve into the complete nature of these debates, which largely focused on when to shift from a prolonged war to a more aggressive strategy for victory, ultimately, The more cautious advocates of a protracted war were outvoted by those pushing for a nationwide offensive. The official account of the PVN outlines the objectives for the general offensive, general uprising, as follows: obliterate and completely dismantle the majority of the South Vietnamese army, overthrow the puppet regime at every level, and return all governing power to the people. They aimed to significantly reduce the American military's troop strength and destroy a substantial amount of equipment, preventing American forces from achieving their political and military aims. The goal was to crush the American resolve to engage in aggression, compel the United States to accept defeat in South Vietnam, and end all hostile actions against North Vietnam. Despite having faced severe setbacks in 1966 and 1967, the Communists still believed the time had come to initiate the general offensive. This is challenging to grasp unless we consider the concept of Coi Nghĩa within Vietnamese Communist ideology. The Vietnamese perspective on a general offensive, which Maoist thought sees as requiring a prolonged struggle, was quickened by the belief that a general uprising, or Coi Nghĩa, would support the offensive in achieving a decisive victory. Through Đao Tran, their dual strategy of military and political struggle, the awareness of the people would gradually build over time, ultimately leading to a great spontaneous combustion. In the minds of the communist strategists, the general offensive would triumph because the general uprising, viewed as the peak of years of political Đao Tran, would balance out the American military advantages and topple the Saigon regime. Thus, the general uprising became their ultimate tool. They believed that in the end, ideological purity and revolutionary fervor would prevail, overcoming even the Americans' superior mobility and firepower. Despite their ideology, an examination of various communist documents shows that the Politburo in Hanoi realistically anticipated three possible outcomes for the general offensive and uprising. They articulated them as follows. First, they envisioned winning significant victories on key battlefields, with their attacks and uprisings succeeding in major cities, ultimately diminishing the American will to fight and compelling them to negotiate an end to the war on their terms. Second, they acknowledged that even if they gained important victories in several areas, the enemy would still have forces remaining. Leveraging their large bases and bringing in reinforcements from outside, the enemy would retaliate to reclaim crucial positions in major cities, especially Saigon, in order to continue the struggle against them. Third, they feared that the United States would increase troop levels, expand the conflict into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, forcing them to react in ways that would alter the nature of the war and escape from their current state of defeat. After assessing these possible outcomes, the communist leadership allowed their revolutionary fervor and essentially wishful thinking to override sound military judgment. Later on, they realized they had only planned for one scenario. The general offensive and uprising would certainly lead to victory. This meant they hadn't considered any changes or developments that could arise. They never actually talked about the other possible outcomes outlined in their orders. Another Vietnamese commentator pointed out that, in reality, the three outcomes they discussed were essentially just one possible outcome. There were no preparations made for what we might today call branch plans. One communist observer acknowledged that this oversight stemmed from their belief that launching a general offensive and uprising would guarantee a decisive victory. But their mistake also came from a misreading of the situation, especially considering they faced an enemy with vast resources. Any result was possible, whether victory or a temporary setback. However, when it came to planning, the communists focused solely on the best-case scenario and disregarded other possible results. Given the heavy losses and the lack of tactical success during the offensive, it's evident the communists shared some of the same flaws that impacted MAC-CV in the lead-up to the offensive. In recent years, various unit histories, journal articles, and other publications have shed new light on the pre-offensive planning on the other side. Reviewing these sources shows that major missteps in communist planning included incorrect assessments of both their own and the enemy's capabilities, faulty reporting, and the effects of ideology and wishful thinking on military judgment. Across the examined sources, there is widespread agreement that the communist evaluation before deciding to launch the general offensive was deeply flawed. A journal article on the Tet Offensive in the Saigon Din area notes that the Central Committee's assessment underestimated the capabilities of the puppet army and government, the response of American military forces, and the abilities of their own political forces. The overestimation of their political forces was particularly significant because it meant that the widespread uprising they had hoped for to counter American military strengths never actually happened. As a result, many of the attacks by the PIVN and VC were destined to fail. From the outset, especially given their timing amidst intense American firepower, it's hard to comprehend how the communists, who had suffered greatly at the hands of the Americans in the preceding 2 years, could misjudge the U.S. military's response. Perhaps their own ideological pride clouded their judgment. The communists' inability to accurately gauge the intelligence regarding the strengths and weaknesses of American and South Vietnamese forces severely impacted the ambitious goals they set for their troops during the offensive. One document from the Ministry of Defense states that the communists established targets that didn't align with the realities of the current situation. Lieutenant General Tran Do, in a 1986 speech assessing the successes and failures of the Tet Offensive, claimed they had set unrealistic and inappropriate goals for Tet 1968. Additionally, a contributor to a Vietnamese military history journal stresses the shortcomings of the communist strategists in understanding the battlefield. He pointed out that if we had approached the situation with greater intelligence, evaluating it in a more grounded, practical, and truthful way, our goals would have been much more realistic. In the official history of the PAVN, an evaluation of the Tet Offensive reveals, we were subjective in our analysis, particularly regarding the strength of the mass political forces in urban areas. We underestimated the enemy's capabilities and reactions, setting our goals too high. Our preparations were one-sided, only focusing on the prospects for victory, while neglecting to brace for setbacks. Several reasons are referenced in the documents for this misjudgment, but the most frequently mentioned is subjectivism. In Vietnamese, chu quan, or subjectivism, contrasts with kak quan, meaning objectivism. To grasp the Vietnamese meaning of subjectivism, one can refer to Webster's New World Dictionary, which defines it as a philosophical theory that limits knowledge by confining external reality to what can be known or inferred through subjective standards of truth. During the Tet Offensive, the communists had already predetermined the campaign's outcome, relying on their own interpretations of subjective truths, unaffected by any opposing realities. The tendency to blame their tactical shortcomings on subjective planning is a recurring theme found in Vietnamese evaluations of the Tet Offensive. An official history of the war in eastern Cochin, China concludes that the main mistake was their overly optimistic assessment of their forces. They set their goals too high, launching a full-scale effort to capture cities while overlooking the importance of securing their control in the rural areas. A similar report about the Tet Offensive in the Tri Thien Hue region recognized that subjectivism played a role in their planning. It stated that they failed to recognize the enemy's strong position within their own territory. This oversight led to a lack of anticipation and an inability to adapt quickly to the actual situation on the ground when dealing with the adversary. It becomes clear that the communist planners were just as culpable as MAC CV for ignoring signs that contradicted their preconceived notions of victory. Their subjective view of the enemy's capabilities stemmed from a mix of wishful thinking, ideological conformity, and arrogance. Despite the realities of war, leaders in Hanoi and the campaign's architects had already concluded that they were destined for success. One report stated that the plan accounted for only one outcome: a definitive victory, with no space for doubts or thoughts of a partial win. They disregarded the fundamental truth that in any confrontation, the opponent has a say. This mindset, once the decision was made to proceed with the offensive, was evident in the field reports during the days and months leading up to it. In the Saigon Din sector, the reports from the field, lower-level reports often failed to truly represent the reality of the situation. inflating accomplishments while ignoring mistakes. Similar sentiments are echoed in a piece from the Tet 20th anniversary issue of a Vietnamese military journal. It highlights the misjudgments in gauging enemy strength prior to the offensive, noting another crucial factor was the dishonesty in lower-level reports. These reports exaggerated our successes, leading higher-ups to fall into the trap of wishful thinking. Such misrepresentations downplayed American and South Vietnamese capabilities, which played a role in the defeat of the communist forces once the initial shock of the offensive wore off. There was immense pressure to adhere to the party narrative, particularly for those who might have recognized that the timing of the offensive was questionable. One report on the offensive encapsulates this theme. We lacked the bravery to accurately depict the challenges we faced to higher authorities and to propose solutions. As a result, an arrogance permeated both the planners and those executing the attacks when the offensive commenced. It was regarded as nearly certain to succeed. An article from 1988 in Military History magazine describes this sentiment of guaranteed success. Everyone, from high-ranking officials to the lowest frontline soldier, focused solely on one goal, finishing them off. That's why we burned the huts in our headquarters, believing we were leaving for good. In reality, everyone was fixated on a single outcome, with no regard for whether it aligned with military principles. This arrogance resulted in a narrow focus that was just as detrimental to the communists as it had been to Massey V. Convinced that conditions were ripe for a major offensive and uprising, planners and decision-makers ignored any intelligence or assessments that contradicted their preconceived ideas. The consequences of this misjudgment were catastrophic for the opposing side. Conservative estimates suggest that communist losses in 1968 were around 40,000. While this figure is debated, a look at some historical records from the offensive shows just how significantly the communists misjudged their situation before launching the attack. A report from the Tri Thien Hu area noted the heavy toll on communist forces there, stating that they had 3,600 wounded soldiers alone, not including guerrillas and local leaders. Their organizations were in chaos, they faced shortages of food and ammunition, their combat effectiveness had diminished, and their agents in villages and cities had either retreated to the mountains or lost contact with their headquarters. The devastating losses suffered were further highlighted in accounts from Group 559, the unit responsible for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which mentioned that 8 times as many wounded were sent back to the rear area in 1968 compared to 1967. These staggering losses took a significant toll on the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong. An official history from Military Region 9, which included the area the NLF called Western Nam Bo, described late 1968 and early 1969 as follows. Our main force units were critically short on personnel. Where province units had previously fielded 2 or 3 battalions before the Tet Offensive, now each province had only 1 battalion with around 100 men. Districts that once had full companies, sometimes 2 or 3, were left with just 1 company made up of a handful of cadres and soldiers. Some districts had only a platoon remaining. Additionally, a history from Military Region 8, located just south of Saigon, pointed out similar challenges after the offensive in late 1968, revealing heavy casualties and an inability to engage in sustained combat to defeat the enemy. They noted that their civilian mass movement continued to weaken daily, and military leadership at all levels was confused and disorganized in their responses. The war in eastern Cochin China clearly shows that the flaws in planning and preparation for the offensive resulted in significant consequences on the battlefield that persisted for years. While it's undeniable that there was a severe breakdown in American intelligence that added to the psychological toll of the Tet Offensive, it's equally clear that the other side faced a similar intelligence failure, one that cost them 40,000 of their best soldiers. American leaders couldn't foresee the offensive, as they were hampered by their own biases regarding enemy strength and the need to maintain a positive outlook to support a struggling presidential administration back home. On the other hand, the communists experienced their own form of intelligence blindness, driven by arrogance and ideological zeal. Both instances of intelligence failure can be likened to what one of my mentors referred to as drinking your own bathwater. Intelligence is a fundamental reality. Manipulating, misusing, or ignoring it for political or ideological aims is a perilous choice that typically leads to severe consequences. This was particularly true during the Tet Offensive. In the end, the Communists managed to overcome their intelligence errors and went on to secure victory, while we did not, resulting in defeat for America and the extinction of the Republic of Vietnam. As the United States marks its third year of war in Iraq, the military remains on the lookout for strategies to confront an insurgency that shows no signs of receding. The shadow of Vietnam is ever present, and media comparisons between the current situation and the perceived quagmire of the Vietnam War are common. Though there are numerous differences between the two conflicts, valuable lessons can be drawn from the Vietnam experience, provided they are approached thoughtfully. For better or worse, Vietnam stands as the most cited historical example of American counterinsurgency and is also the longest. Dismissing it due to its undeniably complex and controversial nature would be a mistake. Analyzing the pacification efforts in Vietnam and the evolution of the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program provides critical insights into the essentials of a successful counterinsurgency strategy. In Vietnam, the U.S. military confronted what many consider the most intricate, effective, and deadly insurgency in history. This was not just a disorganized group hiding in the jungle. It was a skilled mix of guerrillas, political operatives, and organized main force units ready to stand against the U.S. military. Each of these elements posed a significant challenge on its own, but together they formed a serious threat. When U.S. ground forces entered South Vietnam in 1965, estimates indicated that the enemy's guerrilla and Communist Party forces exceeded 300,000. Additionally, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese main forces counted nearly 230,000, and by the time the Communists claimed victory in 1975, that number had surged to 685,000. These main forces were structured into regiments and divisions, and from 1965 to 1968, the enemy shifted its focus from insurgency to main force warfare. Throughout the conflict, the Communists carried out three significant conventional offensives: the Tet Offensive in 1968, the Easter Offensive in 1972, and the final offensive in 1975. Each of these was a major campaign by any measure. Clearly, both the insurgency and the main enemy forces required simultaneous attention. When faced with such a dual threat, what should be the approach? Should military leaders prepare for a counterinsurgency, or should they focus on eliminating the enemy's main forces? General William C. Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. troops under the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, grappled with this very dilemma. Recognizing the dual threats South Vietnam faced, Westmoreland concluded that the primary concern was the enemy's main forces. He likened them to bully boys with crowbars, intent on demolishing the structure of South Vietnam. While he acknowledged that the guerrillas and political operatives, which he referred to as termites, also posed a risk to that structure, he felt they would take much longer to cause damage. Thus, even as he understood the importance of pacification efforts, his focus first turned to the bully boys whom he aimed to repel. Westmoreland's strategy of pursuing the enemy and compelling them to engage or retreat, known as search and destroy, proved effective in that it prevented South Vietnam from facing immediate defeat, forced the enemy's main forces out of populated areas, and temporarily shifted the initiative away from the Communists. In the short term, South Vietnam was safeguarded. Communist narratives clearly illustrate that the arrival of U.S. troops delivered a significant setback to their strategies. Ultimately, the number of U.S. soldiers was insufficient to achieve more than a stalemate. The Communists continued to send their main force units across from neighboring Laos and Cambodia, and divided their forces into smaller groups that could evade confrontation when the circumstances favored them. The enemy steadily grew stronger, and in January 1968, they launched the Tet Offensive, demonstrating that the Americans could never truly seize the initiative. While the assaults were repelled in nearly every major city and town, resulting in the deaths of around 50,000 enemy soldiers and guerrillas. The offensive emerged as a political triumph for the Communists, affirming their ability to execute significant attacks regardless of American efforts. Counterinsurgency, or pacification as it was typically referred to in Vietnam, confronted the dual challenges of enemy main forces and a persistent guerrilla presence in rural regions. Initial Mass-EV campaign plans highlighted that pacification was just as crucial as military operations, yet the realities on the battlefield pushed it to the sidelines. In January 1966, Westmoreland stated, "It is abundantly clear that all political, military, economic, and security programs must be completely integrated to achieve any level of success in a nation weakened by extended conflict." He looked to the enemy as a model for this integration, noting, "The Viet Cong have learned this lesson well. Their coordination of efforts is far superior to ours." Westmoreland recognized his limitations in conducting both a war of attrition and a war of pacification, opting for the former. The debate over whether this was the correct decision will likely persist indefinitely, but it's evident the nature of the war shifted dramatically after the Tet Offensive. Though the enemy suffered serious losses, they politically gained while losing military initiative for an extended period. As the Communists pulled back from the Tet battlegrounds to recuperate, the following lull created a more favorable setting for a pacification strategy. Westmoreland never encountered such an advantage. When American ground forces entered the conflict in 1965, they faced an attacking enemy. But by June 1968, the new MACV commander, General Creighton W. Abrams, faced an enemy that was on the ropes. He clearly saw his advantage and put into action a clear and hold strategy aimed at entering rural areas that the VC had previously controlled. A history of the war from the Communist perspective notes that they didn't fully grasp the new tactics employed by their opponents and underestimated the enemy's capabilities and the strength of their counterattacks. As the U.S. and its allies began to implement their clear and hold strategy, the Communists found their battlefronts slow to adjust to the push for pacification. To address the evolving situation on the battlefield, the Communist Politburo in Hanoi revised its approach through a document called COSVN Resolution 9. North Vietnam viewed its Tet Offensive as a significant success that forced the enemy deeper into a defensive and stalled position. However, they recognized the need for new strategies to drive the Americans out of the conflict. Instead of directly engaging U.S. troops, Resolution 9 instructed guerrilla forces to scatter and focus their efforts on targeting pacification. The main goal was to outlast the Allies, aiming to compel the Americans to withdraw their troops, bring about the collapse of their local allies, and ultimately achieve a decisive victory. This plan inherently called for a return to traditional hit-and-run guerrilla tactics with less focus on large-scale confrontations. From late 1968 to 1971, the battle for hearts and minds intensified, with the government making significant progress in pacifying the countryside. Historians and military analysts continue to debate the effectiveness of Abrams's strategy compared to Westmoreland's, but it's clear the two generals faced different situations. There was no one right way to approach the conflict. The war was dynamic, with the enemy often setting the operational tempo. The gains in pacification during Abrams's command were largely due to the weakened status of the VC following the 1968 Tet Offensive. Still, with President Richard Nixon's call to Vietnamize the war, the South Vietnamese were left to manage both the main enemy forces and the communist insurgency in the villages. Pacification alone was not enough to handle the challenges. Insurgencies are intricate phenomena that resist all attempts to simplify them. The success of a counterinsurgency strategy hinges on the organization and tactics of the counterinsurgent. The enemy is always evolving, and each scenario presents unique challenges. However, at its core, any counterinsurgency effort must focus on a few key elements. Security forces need to be ready to use military power to protect the civilian population from the enemy. It's a misstep to believe that large-scale operations have no value in counterinsurgency. The significant military actions of 1965 and 1966 denied the Communists a swift victory, and provided South Vietnam the opportunity to stabilize the countryside. Without the safety provided by military action, any attempt at pacification would be impossible. Moreover, government forces must aim to undermine the insurgents' ability to operate and thrive within local communities. Given the opportunity, insurgents will attempt to establish underground political frameworks to supplant government authority in villages. This network forms the backbone of guerrilla control during an insurgency, weaving the entire movement together. Without widespread political influence, guerrillas struggle to make progress, and any advancements they do achieve cannot be sustained. To succeed in a counterinsurgency, we must focus on dismantling the insurgent infrastructure as a primary goal. These aims, ensuring public safety and targeting the insurgent network, are fundamental to a credible government strategy for winning popular support. Initiatives that enhance the quality of life, such as land reform, healthcare, education, and agricultural support, are essential for the government to present a legitimate alternative to insurgents. Yet, the harsh truth is that no progress can be made without first establishing a basic level of security. A vital aspect of this entire strategy is the alignment of all efforts toward a common purpose. This might seem straightforward, but it often fails to materialize. In many historical counterinsurgency campaigns, military forces focus solely on combat objectives, leaving the responsibilities of building infrastructure, such as schools and clinics, and strengthening local governments, often referred to as nation building, to civilian agencies. The truth is, neither mission holds greater importance than the other, and neglecting this fact can be detrimental. Almost every counterinsurgency operation depends on their interconnection. Plans assert they unify the two. The provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan and the now defunct Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq were efforts to merge and synchronize civilian and military agencies, though neither truly met its goals. In this context, the development of the CORDS program during the Vietnam War serves as a strong example of creating a chain of command that integrates both civilian and military efforts into a focused initiative. In the early 1960s, the American Advisory Mission in Vietnam aimed to counter communist influence in rural areas. This effort faltered for various reasons, but a major factor was the South Vietnamese government's failure to provide security to its many villages and hamlets. This shortcoming ultimately led to the deployment of American ground forces and a rapid surge in U.S. military personnel in 1965, with troop strength rising dramatically from 23,300 at the end of 1964 to 184,300 just a year later. The sharp increase in troop numbers strained the already fragile balance between the military mission and pacification, prompting many officials to argue that pacification was being sidelined. By early 1965, the U.S. pacification efforts included several civilian agencies, with the CIA, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. Information Service, and the Department of State being the most significant. Each agency created its own initiatives and coordinated them through the American Embassy. On the military side, the rapid troop buildup also led to a corresponding rise in the number of advisors. By early 1966, military advisory teams were engaged in all 44 provinces and most of the 243 districts of South Vietnam. The extensive military presence in the countryside complicated the civilian-led pacification program, a challenge heightened by the lack of a formal system to integrate both efforts. In the spring of 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration shifted its focus to pacification, seeking to improve the existing structure. Official visits to South Vietnam and studies from independent observers revealed a significant lack of coordination among civilian agencies. Most analysts concluded that the entire system required a complete overhaul. Johnson took a personal interest in pacification, aiming to bring about essential changes, the weight of his office to find a better way to approach what he termed the other war, or pacification. American Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge received written authority from the president to fully oversee the advisory efforts in Vietnam, using the level of command and control he deemed necessary. Yet that wasn't sufficient. Even though Westmoreland was cooperative, the civilian and military operations just didn't align. After a visit to South Vietnam in November 1965, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara told Westmoreland, "I don't think we have accomplished anything effective in 5 years. Show me one area in this country that we have pacified." McNamara's remarks spurred immediate action. In January 1966, representatives from Washington agencies concerned with the war gathered with those from the U.S. mission in Saigon at a conference in Virginia. During the discussions, they realized that relying solely on the ambassador and the MAFV commander to work things out wouldn't guarantee cooperation and pacification. A unified civil-military focus was essential. However, the conference concluded without a solid plan. Although Johnson was frustrated by the slow pace and resistance, the embassy in Saigon continued to fight against any changes that might diminish its control over pacification. In February 1966, during a summit in Honolulu with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu and Premier Nguyen Cao Khai, Johnson laid out an agenda that tasked the South Vietnamese Army with area security, enabling the U.S. military to focus primarily on locating enemy forces. He also sought improved American coordination in the pacification effort and insisted on appointing a single manager to lead the entire program. In April, he designated Robert W. Comer, a trusted advisor from the National Security Council, to find a solution. Johnson granted Comer significant authority, including unrestricted access to the White House, a critical advantage documented in writing. This power equipped Comer to bring stubborn officials in line. Following this, a series of swift actions took place. In August 1966, Comer wrote a paper titled "Giving a New Thrust to Pacification: Analysis, Concept, and Management," in which he dissected the pacification issue into 3 segments, asserting that no single part could succeed in isolation. The first focus was, unsurprisingly, on security, ensuring that the main forces stayed clear of the civilian population. Next, there was a push to undermine the Communists' influence through anti-infrastructure operations and initiatives aimed at regaining public support. The third emphasis was on scale. In other words, pacification needed to be extensive. Only with a truly widespread approach could real change occur, and that was essential for Johnson to keep public backing for the war. Yet it was Westmoreland who highlighted the issue prominently. Contrary to what many believed, the MACV commander recognized the importance of pacification and, like a shrewd politician, thought it best to have this responsibility under his oversight rather than someone else's. On October 6, 1966, despite pushback from his team, he told Comer, "I'm not seeking this responsibility, but I believe my headquarters could manage it smoothly and possibly carry out this vital function more effectively and efficiently than the current complicated setup." Comer took his case to McNamara, asserting that with 90% of the resources at play, it was clear that only the military had the power to make things happen. He felt the U.S. Defense Department was far stronger behind pacification than the State Department and was infinitely more dynamic and influential. Now that the DoD was on board, the civilian agencies opposed the plan across the board. As a compromise, in November 1966, the Office of Civil Operations was established, led by Deputy Ambassador William Porter. The OCO aimed to integrate civilian agencies under a single chain of command, but did not include the military, which meant the plan was flawed from the outset. The OCO didn't differ much from previous methods, as it kept civilian and military command structures separate. Johnson felt frustrated. Consequently, in June 1966, Comer traveled to Vietnam to evaluate the situation. He noted that the U.S. Embassy needed to bolster its own capacity for pacification. After meeting with Westmoreland, they both recognized the necessity for a singular manager. "My issue isn't with Westy, but with the hesitant civilian side," Comer informed the president. In March 1967, Johnson held a gathering in Guam where he made it clear that the OCO was no longer viable, and Comer's proposal for a single manager would be enacted. Only the paperwork was left to complete, and less than 2 months later, on May 9, 1967, National Security Action Memorandum 362, titled Responsibility for U.S. Role in Pacification, came into effect, creating Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, or CORDS. This new structure clearly placed the military in command of pacification. As the MEM-ACV commander, Westmoreland had 3 deputies, one of whom was a civilian with a rank equivalent to 3 stars, specifically overseeing pacification, all organized under a single command structure. Comer was appointed as the deputy for Chords, working alongside Abrams, the deputy MACV commander. Various civilians and agencies were integrated into the military framework, including an assistant chief of staff positioned with the traditional military staff. For the first time, civilians were included in a wartime command and held authority over military personnel and resources. Chords began operations immediately, introducing a renewed urgency aimed at improving pacification efforts in rural areas. The new organization didn't resolve all issues right away, and it faced its share of challenges. Initially, Comer sought to consolidate power within his office, but Westmoreland quickly made it clear that his military deputies wielded more authority and handled a broader range of responsibilities, leaving Comer limited to matters of pacification. Furthermore, Westmoreland restricted Comer's direct access to the White House, insisting that proper chains of command were maintained. As a result, Comer occasionally felt uncertain about whether he had Westmoreland's complete trust and confidence. Despite these few disagreements, the relationship between the MACV commander and his new deputy grew close and respectful, setting the new program off on the right foot. Time played a vital role, and Comer's assertive character, combined with Westmoreland's growing trust in his civilian subordinates, helped to resolve many potential issues. One study noted that a blend of Westmoreland's adaptability and Comer's ability to navigate it without an additional command layer allowed for an innovative program to flourish within what could have been rigid military constraints. With the new structure, nearly all pacification initiatives fell under Chords. This included oversight of the New Life development, which aimed to enhance government responsiveness to the needs of villagers, as well as refugees, the National Police, and the Chio Hoi program designed to encourage communist personnel in South Vietnam to defect. The CIA's Rural Development Cadre, MACV's Civic Action, Civil Affairs, and the Joint U.S. Public Affairs Office's Field Psychological Operations were also incorporated under Chords. Chords took on the responsibility for reports, evaluations, and field inspections from all agencies. At the Corps level, the Chords organization mirrored that of Chords at the MACV headquarters. The senior U.S. military advisor, typically a 3-star general who also commanded U.S. forces in the area, appointed a deputy for Chords, usually a civilian. This Dep Chords was tasked with overseeing military and civilian plans supporting the South Vietnamese pacification program within the Corps area. Province advisory teams within the Corps area reported directly to the regional Dep Chords. Each of the 44 provinces in South Vietnam was led by a province chief, generally a colonel from the South Vietnamese Army or Marine Corps, who managed the provincial government and commanded the provincial militia, along with regional forces and popular forces. The province advisory teams assisted the province chiefs in implementing the pacification program. The American counterpart to the province chief was the province senior advisor, who could be military or civilian depending on the security situation in that province. The province senior advisor and his team were responsible for guiding the province chief on the civil-military aspects of the pacification and development programs. The staff of the province senior advisor, made up of both U.S. military and civilian members, was split into 2 sections. One focused on area and community development, covering fields like public health, administration, civil affairs, education, agriculture, psychological operations, and logistics. The other section dealt with military matters, supporting the province staff in preparing plans and directing security operations by the territorial forces and affiliated support within the province. The province chief exercised authority via district chiefs, while the senior advisor at the province level oversaw the senior advisors at the district level. Each district advisor typically had a staff of around 8, though this number could vary depending on the specific circumstances in each district. Advisory teams at the district level assisted the chief with the civil-military aspects of the pacification and rural development initiatives. Additionally, the district teams, along with mobile assistance training teams, provided guidance and training for the RFPF present in the district. Every member of the province team served as an advisor, collaborating closely with the province chief and his team to offer support and ensure coordination with U.S. efforts. The sheer numbers, bolstered by military involvement, made cords far more effective than previous pacification attempts. In early 1966, around 1,000 U.S. advisors were engaged in pacification efforts. By September 1969, at the peak of the program, 7,601 advisors were assigned to province and district pacification teams. Of these, 6,464 were military personnel, with 95% coming from the Army. Cords showcased an impressive capacity to deploy manpower, funding, and supplies to rural areas where they were crucially needed. Consider these figures. Between 1966 and 1970, spending on pacification and economic initiatives surged from $582 million to $1.5 billion. Support to the South Vietnamese National Police enabled total paramilitary forces to grow from 60,000 in 1967 to over 120,000 by 1971. Assistance for the RFPF jumped from a mere $300 annually in 1966 to more than $1.5 million by 1971, leading to a total strength increase of over 50%. By 1971, the total territorial militia reached around 500,000, making up about half of the overall South Vietnamese military force. Advisory numbers rose accordingly. From 108 U.S. advisors linked to the militia in 1967, the figure swelled to 2,243 by 1969. The enemy regarded this escalation as a significant threat to their influence in the countryside, and communist sources regularly pointed to the necessity of counterattacking as central to their strategy. So, what impact did all of this have on security? While raw numbers alone don't guarantee successful pacification, they represent a meaningful stride in the right direction. By stationing substantial manpower in the villages, the Allies were able to consistently challenge the guerrillas, leading to considerable progress by 1970. While pacification statistics can be complex and sometimes misleading, they do suggest that cords had an impact on the insurgency. For instance, by early 1970, 93% of South Vietnamese were living in villages deemed relatively secure, marking an increase of nearly 20% from the middle of 1968, a year heavily affected by the Tet Offensive. Cords included numerous programs aimed at increasing South Vietnamese influence in rural areas, but maintaining security was the top priority. The success or failure of pacification hinged on its ability to challenge the insurgents' hold on the population. Military operations focused on keeping enemy forces and guerrillas as distant from civilians as possible, yet the communist presence in the villages extended beyond military means. The cadre managing the Viet Cong infrastructure aimed to establish a communist shadow government to replace the Saigon regime's authority. In 1960, when Hanoi established the Viet Cong movement, formerly known as the National Liberation Front, the cadre were its crucial element. They were the foundation of the revolution, the means through which the communists expanded their reach across South Vietnam. Although not in uniforms, these cadre were just as vital to the armed struggle as any guerrilla armed with an AK. They spread the VCI from the regional level down to nearly every village and hamlet. A common tactic involved killing local government officials to deter others from assuming similar roles. The VC's early success can be attributed to the VCI cadre, which grew to an estimated 70,000 to 100,000 members throughout South Vietnam by 1967. The VCI was straightforward in structure. Almost every village had a cell consisting of a Communist Party secretary, a finance and supply unit, and sections dedicated to information and culture, social welfare, and recruitment efforts among the civilian population. They operated within a chain of command, with village cadre reporting to districts, then provinces, and ultimately to a series of regional commands linked to Hanoi. The Communists strengthened their influence in the countryside through a combination of incentives and threats. The VCI offered medical care, education, and justice, alongside a heavy dose of propaganda, while backed by intimidation from VC guerrillas. The VC executed a targeted terror campaign against select village officials and authority figures to instill fear. Fence-sitters were convinced that supporting the revolution was the right path forward. Essentially, the VCI served as the communist alternative to the Saigon government. In contrast, the South Vietnamese government often struggled to maintain a presence in the villages, and when they did manage to, their lack of a permanent armed force meant their officials could typically only visit during the day. Sadly, during the initial stages of the insurgency, from 1960 to 1963, when the infrastructure was most vulnerable, neither the South Vietnamese nor their American advisors recognized the significance of the VCI. They focused their efforts on battling the guerrillas who, ironically, grew stronger due to the freedom granted by the VCI's influence. The VCI represented a crucial second center of gravity. By 1965, when the United States deployed ground troops in South Vietnam, communist strength had surged dramatically, forcing Westmoreland to prioritize the main force threat and relegating pacification to a secondary role. Though the U.S. didn't completely overlook the VCI, in 1964, the CIA began using counter-terror teams to locate and eliminate cadre hiding in the villages. However, the CIA had only a handful of Americans dedicated to this mission, far too few to make a significant impact on the tens of thousands of VCI members. The introduction of cords changed that landscape, leading to the development of anti-infrastructure operations. In July 1967, the Intelligence Coordination and Exploitation Program, or ISEX, was established as a central hub for VCI information, which was then shared with district advisors. Unfortunately, due to the lack of anti-VCI operations in the war's first 3 years, there was little intelligence available at the start. Some organizations like the RFPF lived in the villages and collected information, but their primary focus was security rather than intelligence gathering. In December 1967, ISEX was given renewed focus and rebranded as Phoenix. The South Vietnamese component was named Phung Hoang, after a mythical bird symbolizing prosperity and good fortune. Cords prioritized Phoenix and quickly expanded intelligence centers across most provinces in South Vietnam. At this point, the emphasis of Phoenix was largely on numbers. Cords increased the overall U.S. advisory efforts, and as a result, the Phoenix program saw substantial benefits. Within months, all 44 provinces and the majority of districts were assigned American Phoenix advisors. This was essential to the overall effort. The government could only effectively conduct counterinsurgency by maintaining a consistent presence in the countryside, essentially reflecting the actions of the insurgents. By 1970, there were 704 U.S. Phoenix advisors stationed across South Vietnam. The Phoenix program, like many initiatives during the war, became critically important during the Tet Offensive. The entire pacification effort was put on pause as Allied forces struggled to prevent the Communists from seizing major cities. If there was any uncertainty prior, Tet demonstrated just how vital the VCI was to the insurgency. It was the secretive cadres who cleared the way for guerrilla fighters and ensured there were supplies and reinforcements to support the offensive. Conversely, the failure of the attacks revealed the vulnerability of the VCI. Consequently, operations targeting the infrastructure became a key element of the pacification strategy. In July 1968, after the enemy offensive had largely fizzled out, the Allies initiated the Accelerated Pacification Campaign, directing new resources toward pacification to take advantage of the post-Tet weakness among the Communists. While the enemy's main forces and guerrillas were recovering, they were less capable of obstructing pacification efforts in the villages. Under the APC, Phoenix focused on 4 key areas in its battle against the VCI. First, there was a decentralization of the old ICX command and control structure, shifting much of the responsibility to the provinces and districts. This included establishing intelligence and interrogation centers, known as District Intelligence and Operations Coordinating Centers, in areas where the VCI operated. Second, there was the creation of files and dossiers on suspects, with a focus on neutralizing VCI members through capture, conversion, or elimination. Third, rules were put in place that allowed suspected VCI members to be tried and imprisoned. Finally, there was an emphasis on local militias and police rather than military forces as the primary operational units of the program. This last element was crucial. While military forces could engage the VCI, they had other urgent obligations, meaning anti-infrastructure operations would always take a back seat. Thus, the program concentrated on existing groups that could be adapted to target the VCI, with the RFPF militia, national police, and provincial reconnaissance units being the most significant. Recruited from local communities, the RFPF were uniquely positioned for anti-VCI operations since they resided in the villages. They not only provided protection against roaming VC guerrillas, but also acted on intelligence provided by the DIOCC. The National Police had two specialized units for VCI operations: the Intelligence-Focused Police Special Branch and the Paramilitary National Police Field Force. Generally, the police struggled to perform effectively, though there were some exceptions. The PRUs, trained and recruited by the CIA, were the most effective force for Phoenix. Yet, like many CIA assets, their numbers were insufficient to tackle the VCI effectively. With no more than 4,000 members nationwide, the PRUs also had other paramilitary responsibilities, limiting their availability. The district formed the foundation of the program, with the DIOC serving as its central hub. Each DIOC was led by a Vietnamese Phung Hoang chief, supported by an American Phoenix advisor who had no power to command operations, but could recommend actions and request U.S. military help. The DIOCC was accountable to the Vietnamese district chief, who then reported to the province chief. DIOC staff gathered intelligence on VCI activities within their districts and created blacklists of VCI members. When feasible, the DIOC aimed to locate suspects and orchestrate operations to apprehend them. Captured individuals were brought to the DIOC for interrogation before being sent to the province headquarters for further questioning and trial. Since Phoenix was decentralized, its implementation varied across districts, with some programs being more effective than others. Several DIOCCs were sluggish, taking long periods to put together even basic blacklists. In many instances, the Phung Hoang chief was an inefficient bureaucrat, exploiting his role for personal gain. To mitigate these issues, Phoenix set monthly neutralization targets, which sometimes resulted in fabricated reports or, in worse cases, wrongful arrests. In certain districts, officials accepted bribes from the VC to release specific suspects, leading to the release of up to 60% of VCI suspects. The portrayal of Phoenix that unfolds is not that of a rogue operation, as it has sometimes been described, but rather as one functioning within a framework of established rules. Special laws known as entry permitted the arrest and prosecution of suspected communists, strictly within the legal framework. To prevent misuse, such as false claims driven by personal motives or unchecked officials rushing to make arrests, entry mandated 3 distinct sources of evidence before convicting anyone targeted for neutralization. If someone identified as a VCI was found guilty, they could face up to 2 years in prison, with renewals potentially extending their sentence to 6 years. While this might seem fair at first glance, hardcore VCIs often spent only 6 years in prison before rejoining the guerrillas. The legal process was never fully refined. Today, the U.S. faces a similar dilemma. Those accused of terrorism and held at Guantanamo Bay and other facilities find themselves in a murky legal limbo that remains largely unresolved by policymakers. Was there an assassination bureau? Between 1968 and 1972, the Phoenix program neutralized 81,740 VC, resulting in 26,069 deaths. This substantial impact diminished the VCI, and from 1969 to 1971, the program effectively targeted key areas of the VCI. However, these numbers have led some to label Phoenix as an assassination initiative, which it was not. While people were killed, statistics indicate that more than 2/3 of the neutralized VC were captured rather than killed. In fact, capturing Viet Cong was crucial for Phoenix to gather the intelligence necessary to catch more VC. Although there were instances of abuse, including torture, which U.S. stasis advisors sometimes struggled to stop, most understood the principle that dead Viet Cong could not reveal information about those who were still alive. Phoenix also faced accusations of targeting civilians since the VCI didn't wear military uniforms. However, the VCI was a key part of the insurgency and represented legitimate targets. We should have better articulated this to our critics. Did Phoenix contract out the difficult tasks? Another criticism was that Phoenix depended on other units for neutralizing the VCI. Of the 26,000 VCIs killed, a significant 87% were casualties during operations led by conventional forces. So, how effective was Phoenix if it contributed to just 13% of the total fatalities? A subsequent study revealed that only about 20% of the killed or captured neutralizations came from Phoenix resources, with the majority occurring during sweeps by regular units or RFPF operations. Both arguments hold little weight. Direct physical action was the conventional force, with the RF and PF playing their part in a two-step process. Ultimately, the goal should have been the permanent removal of 26,000 VCI, regardless of who did it. Statistics created their own issues. In the first 2 years of the Phoenix program, each province received a monthly target for VC neutralization based on local infrastructure size. These targets were often unrealistic, leading to false reporting or the detention of innocent individuals due to personal grudges. In 1969, the quotas were reduced, and from then on, no VC could be counted unless there was a court conviction. Critics also pointed out that Phoenix primarily captured mid- and low-level VC, while senior leaders escaped. In 1968, before the VCI adapted to Phoenix's aggressive tactics, around 13% of neutralizations targeted district and higher-level cadre. By 1970 and 1971, that figure fell to about 3%. However, this decline masked two significant outcomes. Phoenix forced higher-ranking VC to retreat to safer locations, complicating their control over village populations, and by targeting mid-level Viet Cong, Phoenix effectively severed the ties between the populace and the leadership calling the shots, delivering a serious setback to the VCI. Ultimately, going after the VCI wasn't as challenging as it might appear. The VCI operated as a clandestine organization, but needed to stay connected to the population to be effective, which made them vulnerable. Guerrillas could blend into the bush. Meanwhile, the VCI had to maintain relationships with the people. While not entirely successful, anti-infrastructure operations created significant problems for the enemy, forcing them to take drastic measures to mitigate the impact. By 1970, communist strategies continually highlighted the need to disrupt the government's pacification efforts, specifically targeting Phoenix officials. District and village leaders became victims of VC assassinations and terror as the communists aimed to regain control of areas lost in 1969 and 1970. Ironically, the VC engaged in the very tactics that critics condemned in Phoenix, the assassination of officials, and even established their own quotas. In 1970, for instance, communist officials nearby. In northern South Vietnam, Da Nang ordered VC assassins to eliminate 1,400 individuals labeled as government tyrants and to wipe out anyone involved in the pacification program. While the anti-infrastructure program didn't completely dismantle the VCI, it likely slowed their progress when combined with other pacification efforts. In the context of Vietnam's mix of guerrilla and main force warfare, this wasn't enough to secure victory, yet it's evident that without the Phoenix program, pacification efforts would have faced far greater challenges. This is supported by accounts from the communists after the war. In Vietnam, A History, Stanley Carno quotes Let Gen Tran Do, the North Vietnamese deputy commander in the South, who stated that Phoenix was extremely destructive. Former Viet Cong Minister of Justice Truong Nhu Tang, in his memoirs, noted that Phoenix was dangerously effective, revealing that in Hao Nghĩa province, west of Saigon, the front infrastructure was virtually eliminated. Moreover, Nguyen Co Thach, who became Vietnam's foreign minister after the war, claimed, "We had many weaknesses in the South because of Phoenix." Clearly, the political infrastructure is essential to nearly all insurgencies, and it should be a top priority for counterinsurgents right from the start. In Vietnam, the Allies confronted an insurgency that balanced political and military strategies. However, before the Tet Offensive weakened the Communists enough to focus on both main force warfare and pacification, it was challenging to give the necessary attention to anti-infrastructure operations. Yet in just 2 years, from 1968 to 1970, the Phoenix program achieved notable successes against the VCI. One wonders what might have transpired if the Americans and South Vietnamese had initiated it in 1960, when the Viet Cong were in a much weaker position. Historian Richard A. Hunt describes the accomplishments of CORDS and the pacification program in Vietnam as ambiguous. Many high-ranking officials involved in the program, including Comer, CIA Director William Colby, and Gen. Bruce Palmer, Westmoreland's military deputy, assert that CORDS made significant progress between 1969 and 1972. Some historians challenge this view, but it's clear that progress was made in the years following the Tet Offensive, with significant improvements in security in various areas, allowing regular South Vietnamese troops to engage in combat. The North Vietnamese and Main Force VC units were countered by a program that expanded Saigon's influence and bolstered the government's credibility among the South Vietnamese populace. Evidence indicates that Hanoi initiated a significant offensive in 1972 to counteract the progress South Vietnam had made in pacifying the region and dismantling the VCI. However, those achievements turned out to be inconsequential in the long run. Although the South Vietnamese, supported by U.S. advisors and overwhelming air power, effectively repelled North Vietnam's invasion in 1972, U.S. forces later withdrew following the Paris Peace Accords. When fighting resumed shortly after the 1973 ceasefire, South Vietnamese troops performed reasonably well, but ultimately fell to the final North Vietnamese offensive in 1975. In the end, it was the conventional forces of the Communists, rather than the insurgents, that triumphed over the South Vietnamese. Regardless of the ultimate outcome, there were valuable lessons to take from Vietnam. The U.S. military applied some of these insights to conflicts in the Philippines and El Salvador during the 1980s. Now that counterinsurgency is back in focus, it's crucial for planners to revisit the pacification strategies used in Vietnam. The most vital lessons to remember include the following. First, achieving unity of effort is essential. There must be a cohesive structure that integrates military and pacification activities. The pacification efforts in Vietnam only began to progress once the various agencies involved were coordinated under a single manager within the military command structure. Once CORDS and Phoenix were integrated into the military hierarchy, it became easier to accomplish tasks. The military often views pacification as the responsibility of civilian organizations. However, it's the military that has the necessary resources, equipment, and personnel to effectively carry out the mission. An insurgency can only thrive as long as it maintains a presence among the people. Therefore, initiating anti-infrastructure operations should be a top priority in any counterinsurgency plan. Establish an intelligence framework right away to identify targets and utilize local forces to engage them. Do not keep the anti-infrastructure initiative secret, as that could lead to a negative perception. Inform the people that the government plans to address infrastructure as part of the security strategy. It's crucial that locals conduct most of the anti-infrastructure actions, while Americans remain in a supporting role. Lastly, create a clear legal framework for the pacification program, especially the effort against infrastructure. If initiated promptly and executed consistently, people are more likely to embrace it. Legality posed challenges in Vietnam, and it remains a pressing issue today. An insurgency won't be overcome just through military engagement. The battle is for the loyalty of the people, so it's crucial to launch a government-wide initiative to improve the lives of those in rural areas. Progress must accompany anti-infrastructure actions, or the populace may perceive government measures as oppressive. Above all, Americans must remember that the local government is responsible for maintaining security and creating effective institutions that address the people's needs, especially since the local forces will have to sustain themselves once U.S. troops depart. These insights may seem obvious, and sure, they're easy to pinpoint with the benefit of hindsight. However, putting them into action is quite challenging. Yet, that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to apply the lessons learned in Southeast Asia to Iraq and Afghanistan. CORDS stands out as one of the successes of the Vietnam War, and its well-planned and well-implemented programs that merged civilian and military efforts provide a valuable model for current and future counterinsurgency operations. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, because in our next episode, we'll explore the Battle of Hue, the most intense urban combat of the war, and the moment U.S. troops realized the enemy was waging an entirely different kind of warfare. You won't want to miss it.